Hello and welcome. You're listening to Adventures in the Vale, an RPG discussion podcast. I'm Jake.
I'm Ross.
Sit back and relax by the fire, for there are tales to be told.
Hello, travelers. Welcome to the Cozy Crow. Come and sit by our fire. May I get you something to drink?
Yeah, I'll take an ale.
I'll have that right out.
Greetings and welcome back to the Adventures in the Vale Tavern Cast. My name is Ross McClure, also known as Mythic Mountains. Here on the Tavern Cast, we talk about folk RPGs, indie RPGs, and the OSR. I'm joined today by someone most people in the OSR have heard of. Everyone in the OSR has benefited from his work. Some might say his initial work was the beginning in recent times of folk RPGs entirely, helping to navigate the waters during the release of the first OGL over 20 years ago, which led to the release of the first published retroclone of the original fantasy role-playing game with Stuart Marshall, and later the definitive retroclone of original Dungeons & Dragons. Matt Finch is the owner of Mythmere Games. It's hard to cover all of Matt's contributions to the hobby, but just to name a few in recent times, we've got, in my opinion, the best ran Kickstarters I've ever participated in, with products like the Tome of Adventure Design, which is useful for really any RPG or even any gameplay style, not just the OSR, for the creation of adventures and also just about any genre. And then recently we also got an updated edition of Swords and Wizardry, which is probably the best known retroclone of original Dungeons and Dragons. And that's just to name a couple of the major products that have come out from Mythmere Games. Matt, thanks for chatting with us. I also want to express our gratitude. My friends and I, we play Swords and Wizardry every week. In fact, we just played last night, so it's brought us hundreds of hours, probably, of joy and fun. So,
well, thank you for having me on the show. I'm glad to hear that that you guys are playing and enjoying Swords and Wizardry, and that's always the best thing that you can hear from out there.
Yeah, and it's hard to have you on and not want to talk about the products specifically, but the reason I wanted to speak with you is something that we have a passion about in our play club. We have an online play club. It's called Mythic Mountains RPG. We focus on what we would call folk RPGs, which it's hard to condense a definition of easily, but essentially it's we would say RPGs that the fan community drives, and the table is kind of the locus of authority instead of a brand holder.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense out there. I mean, we've seen, sort of. I usually call that cottage industry publishing when I'm talking about
nice.
the DIY gamers who are putting stuff out mostly for free. The online communities that are out there, and I think they're absolutely. I think you put your finger on it. There is a grassroots gaming. I wouldn't really call it a movement because it's not a movement, but lots and lots of little movements. But there's definitely a grassroots aspect to the hobby that's very, very different from the goals and the types of products that publishers come out with.
Yeah, and one of the things that we kind of focus on or are really passionate about is how do you bridge that gap, because I think there is a gap, because when I started to regularly play Dungeons and Dragons in particular, I think the first game I played was GURPS, and my game master was into kind of more indie games and stuff, but I was fascinated by Dungeons and Dragons. I wanted to try it, so I had never heard of Swords and Wizardry, and this was in 2015. So here I am, 2015. I want to play Dungeons and Dragons. If someone had told me then and had helped me start playing something like White Box or Swords and Wizardry or Old School Essentials, I would have had the D&D I wanted then that would have conveyed my idea of D&D and the fun that I wanted to have. But I ended up kind of on this long, circuitous journey through Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. Some of it brought me a lot of joy, some of it brought me a lot of frustration. And it took me 6 years of being in the 5e ecosystem to even hear about swords and wizardry. But then even beyond that, there was this big cognitive dissonance. There was this gap that I had to cross because the approach to the game was very different. Now, so I wanna talk to you about this document that you wrote in 2008. A quick primer for old school gaming. And in particular, I wanna take the first few paragraphs, which I think that's an approach to helping people bridge this gap that I don't think a lot of people talk about. But before we do that, I would be interested to kind of know the environment of the time. So, this is 20 to 15 years ago, and people are coming from 3rd edition, and 4th edition is just coming out. What was it like, and why did you write this document? Like, what was it? Were the challenges similar to people trying to, come over to Shadowdark today? Because you had this really successful Kickstarter for a fantasy adventure game, right? And there's this whole crowd of people from the brand hobby and the modern hobby, and they're trying to figure out how to play this play style. But what was it back like? Why did you write this document, and what was it like back then?
Sure. Well, I guess first of all, a couple of structural things. As far as I recall, there was no knowledge that 4th edition was on its way out. That was actually one of Wizards of the Coast's publicity mistakes, was that they kept keeping that secret, and actually they intimated that there was not going to be a new edition. And so, as far as everyone knew, we were still in a 3rd edition environment, and it had been very popular and was still very popular out there. And the other thing I think structurally to realize is that although Kickstarter exists, I think at that point in time, it is very small, and it is not the industry driver yet that it is nowadays. For anybody who started playing with 5th edition, just as a time benchmark, anybody who started playing 5th edition has been in a situation where Kickstarter drives all of the third-party publishing environment, just because it's the best way to get something out there and get eyes on a product. But at that point in time, it was not. And so we are in this, and I guess the other thing to realize is that there has been an old school renaissance. I usually start the old school renaissance at about 2004, 2005. I think of it more as a community, an online community, and it has changed in meaning at this point to having more to do with publishers. But at that point in time, even the internet was not as all pervasive. It was a very powerful force at that point, obviously, but the internet community of old school gaming was still building at that point. It had started about 2000 and probably as early as 2002, but it really was rolling about 2004. And so that community was building up, and it wasn't very well defined because people were coming to it from all sorts of different, preferences. People who liked just retro gaming, people who liked simpler gaming, people who liked the blue maps that were done with TSR, people who liked TSR. It was a lot of different, groups of people and groups of interest, and they weren't very well thought out at that point yet. It was just people gravitating to a couple of communities, and it was mainly one forum, Dragon's Foot, and then a couple of smaller forums that were associated with the Dragon's Foot, Knights and Knaves, probably being the largest one, and that was where Osric got started out. So that's the overall sort of shape of history at that point in time. And the biggest thing that we were running into was people who had started gaming with 3rd edition, because there were a lot of people at that point. 3rd edition's been out since about the year 2000, so it's been out for 8 years. And so there's a whole generation of new gamers who had never played any of the pre-2000 TSR versions of the game. And when we were coming out with Swords and Wizardry, I discovered that the most prevalent hiccup that people had when they were trying to get their groups to play with it was this idea that there were rules missing from the game.
Oh,
Um, and there were, because third edition was a very, very elegant interlocking system. You had your character classes, but all of the character classes referred to feats. They all referred to skills. They all had one unified resolution mechanism of, a D20 against a difficulty class, which is still what's in place now. But they all tried to use those systems regardless of which character class it was. And so, and this is actually my criticism of third edition, is that I think it was over elegant and over interlocking for the type of improvisational play that I enjoy with Dungeons and Dragons. And we'll get back to the term improvisational play. So the main thing I was trying to do with the old school primer was to give a general overview of, this is the way it was done back in the day, because you had the group of people who were saying it's missing rules, and then you had a group of people who were just like, hey, I started with third edition, what was it like back in the day? And so it was sort of a two-barreled shotgun approach of, this is how you approach the issue of the so-called missing rules. And then secondly, here are a bunch of things that you do when you are playing without those rules, sort of more of a practical guide to how to play. So there's the answer to the what did the historical landscape look like and what were the objectives.
okay. Yeah, great. So what I'd like to do, so let's kind of return to this document. So you use this document as like, all right, here's how you do this different approach. Like this, is that right? Like this different
Yep.
approach, so you can access a game. It doesn't have a single discrete resolution mechanic. Okay. So the document itself, I won't go over all of it, but what it does, just for people listening, is for the most part, it uses the example of play, which you'll find in a lot of role-playing games, where it actually lists it out almost like a script, like, hey, here's what it would look like with people playing. But what it does is a side-by-side comparison, and it says, all right, here's what it might look like in third edition, and here's what it would maybe look like in Swords and Wizardry. And that's what the bulk of the document is about. But what I want to do is zoom in on just the first two paragraphs, because I'll tell you, for me, so like I was saying, I had been in the 5e ecosystem for 6 years, trying to make games work, trying to figure out the kind of game I wanted, and then 6 years in, discover games like Knave. And I'd never heard of it, had no way of knowing about it. It didn't have the market. There wasn't, like you go to Walmart and there's a box set for Dungeons and Dragons. You can find Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. If you Google Dungeons and Dragons, that's what will come up. So without my kind of Google algorithm being retaught, as it has in the past couple of years, there was really no way to know that Swords and Wizardry even existed for me at the time. I have seen, in that process, I've worked with dozens of people that have tried to make this leap. Like, they're like, okay, I want to try an old school Renaissance game. And here's some things I've seen, like common approaches. One of them is just tell them it's D&D. Don't worry about it. I kind of call that the catfishing approach, which I don't. Yeah, and I don't mean to criticize it, because these may be like completely brand new players, but that doesn't work well if they're coming from the brand game. Another one is, well, compare it to a cultural touchstone. Say it's like Indiana Jones, it's survival horror, or something like that. And then a third approach, and this is the most common one I see, is minimize the differences to ease the transition. Now this dominates the conversation in my experience of how to help people get in. And so you do things like, start with a old school game, and then give the characters feats, more hit points, or you essentially create a simplified version of just the modern game. And I have found that these approaches don't work. Especially the last one. What it does is it creates a cognitive dissonance. So I heard players say things like, I feel like I have a level 0 character. I feel like I don't have anything. I don't have any abilities. So it's just not fun. And when I discovered this document, the Quick Primer for Old School Gaming, what I found was a completely different approach that I wish I had started with 3 years ago when I came into the OSR and I was trying to get my friends into it. And what the document suggests is some pretty drastic changes to how you would think about gaming. It says, essentially, if you take Swords and Wizardry and you play it, and you're going to play it just like you would play 3rd edition, it says here it will produce a completely pathetic gaming experience, and you'll come to the conclusion that all sorts of things don't work. And my understanding of their approach is that it suggests an active mentorship, that you help players develop what are really a different set of skills, like on how you teach, you show, you guide. It says things like a fundamental modern gaming concept turned completely on its head, and it says it seems impossible to a modern gamer's ear to even approach it this way. In other words, it's saying having an open mind and then willing to approach the game completely differently. What I observe here, packed into these 2 paragraphs, is a completely a different approach than what I see usually recommended. And I don't see a lot of people talking about it. And in general, this idea that, hey, if you're going to come into an old school game, you might need to, well, to quote it again, take a fundamental gaming concept and you have to completely put it on its head. You'll have to re-examine how you even approach games. And what I'd like to do, Matt, with you is look at this now 16 years later and look at it, and could it be said where it says here, if you want to try a one shot of 0E using the free rules and you use it the modern game, could you just as easily say, if you want to try a one shot of Shadowdark, or if you want to try one shot of Knave, or and you try to run it just like you would 5e or Pathfinder, could you just as easily say that? Or how has this changed by 2023? Like, how can we help people come to these games now?
Okay. Well, let me throw you a curveball, first of all, which is that in the next Kickstarter that we're going to do, we are going to include a revised version of the Quick Primer for Old School Gaming.
That is awesome and wild.
In that book, and probably do a PDF. And it's been a long time coming, but if for no other reason, just we're now at a point where 3rd edition is as far in the past for 5th edition players as the old school versions were at the time that we originally came out with this. So
right.
The references to there's no such thing as a spot check. Well, it's not called a spot check anymore. It's a perception check now. So some of the vocabulary that was used for the 3rd edition rules is just wrong for the modern gamer who would have started with 5th edition. But there are also a few other things that I think are important that I wanted to add in there. So we'll get to that. But first, the question was about Shadowdark and Knave. And one thing that's different here is that Shadowdark and Knave have both been written with the objective of being playable for a 5th edition audience because they were constructed from the ground up. They're using old school principles, but Kelsey and Ben both had the knowledge of, they had the capability to start from scratch with the idea of writing something that was old school on the one hand, but that was translatable into 5th edition. Whereas what I started with, many years ago, there were only a couple of retroclones at that point. Retroclones weren't a particularly huge thing at that point in time. And I was just going, more from the retroclone perspective rather than from a game style. It wasn't clear to people really that whether old school gaming was a style of gaming or whether it was a set of rules or what exactly it was that we were even talking about there. And that was one of the things that I was trying to clarify, but it's, my opinion only. The approach that it mainly has to do with the fact that it's an open-ended rule set that doesn't have any sort of interlocking skill or feat type of things, that those are improvised, during play by the players and the
Interesting.
GM. So I think that Shadowdark and Knave are probably going to be a way of introducing people to old school gaming that is, on the one hand, easier, and on the other hand, probably won't be um, as rich an old school experience as using one of the actual original old school systems.
Yeah,
Um,
I would agree with that.
Simply because decisions have to be made by a designer. And that was the thing, was I took myself out of the design process and just said, look, here's the old version. Whereas Kelsey and Ben are doing some actual design. Decisions have to be made. Things have to get cut out in order to make it do what you want to do. So my guess is that, that it will be easier, and that probably depending on which one of those two systems you use, you'll be gaining or losing, different things, in terms of the overall experience. And that's not to say anything bad about either one of those two systems. It's just that they're coming at it from a slightly different objective, only slightly, but it is a different objective than when you're working with an actual, retro clone of the original rules.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I am obsessed with swords and wizardry, and with what I observe is almost two different strands of DNA. And I'm kind of, so here I am, not having a background in this, and I'm sort of discovering this almost in an archaeological manner, where, because the Library of Alexandria, I suppose, is gone, right? Google Plus and a lot of those communities, and now it's fractured. And I meet some Dragon's Foot people here, I meet some people there, but there's not some place I can go and learn how to play First Edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons per se. I have to actually just find a master of that. So it's it's a very old. But anyways, that I observe after having played some OSR games for a while, that that almost has its own DNA. The systems will, like the Assassin, right? Like the Assassin has all of this diegetic stuff in the world. It has a page worth of like saying, well, once you get to this point, you must kill the assassin above you before you can be recognized. And there's no rule. There's no number or dice roll for that. And that's an entire, to me, I see that in original D&D and advanced D&D, that there's this DNA they share that does things. And of course, like, there is no universal bell curve per se. A fighter might get a bonus, but a thief may not on an attribute. And modern OSR games, it seems they took the BX kind of DNA and they use it for minimalism and a kind of a different approach. I use those examples because in Shadowdark in particular, I'm in their Discord, and there are probably a dozen people a day that say, I can't find a rule for using two-handed weapons, and I'm paralyzed. So these two paragraphs answer that question. And they, so what product is this going to be paired with for Kickstarter? Is that...
Well, it'll be in the... where the main product is... there's going to be a supplemental rule book, and it'll be in there. And then there'll also be a monster book, and probably some other things, tied in there. But we're probably also going to release the old school primer separately, as a free PDF, and we may print some out and sell them. We'll see. But it was just that since I was working on this supplement and was talking with Susie, who is the other owner of Mythmere Games, and she said, she was talking about how look, there's a lot of introductory sort of stuff that you've already done with the old school primer. And I'm like, well, yeah, but it's really old. It's not really on point anymore. So she suggested, go ahead and redo it. And I usually am pretty resistant to the idea of redoing something that people out there in the world view as a classic, because you then get people who are referring to the original version and some people who are referring to the second version.
Right.
There's confusion about it. But I think it's probably been long enough that it won't create that kind of difficulty. And I think that the main thing that to add to it, because when I wrote the original old school primer, I was mainly focused on What's universal about this? Okay, well, let's look at the rules. And so it was this fact that the old school systems generally don't have rules for things that are normally done by skills feats and ability checks. And I focused on that. But I think there's another equally important thing about it, which has to do with the social contract at the table and the way in which it's played, because and it does follow from the fact that the rule set is much smaller and that you are making rulings, not rules. But it's really maybe better stated, that second part of it, that it is that the old school game, what you're doing is you're improvising. The GM is improvising rulings. Sometimes they're deciding whether or not to even use a rule, and then the players also are improvising, their um, approach to solving a problem in the game. And so there's it's simply it comes down to the word improvisational. And I think that it maybe would make less, argument, less fuss, or more understanding, or so on and so forth, to say, look, it's not so much an issue of whether you are um, playing a game that has a lot of rules or doesn't have a lot of rules. The difference is, are you playing D&D with do you want to play it with a comprehensive rule set, or do you want to play it with a largely improvised rule set? Do you want to play an improvisational game, or do you want to play a more rules based game? And that distinction between the two styles, I think that actually captures the difference in style, in the feel of play at the table, more than just the sort of approach that I took with the original old school primer of this is what it looks like in the third edition approach, whereas this is what it looks like, as a script, like you said. This is what it looks like, using the old school approach. And I'm still using old school scripts there because I think it's really useful for people to see what this looks like in practice, rather than
Yeah,
just a sort of theoretical, there are fewer rules. Okay, well, what does that mean? That means
right.
nothing.
That kind of sounds like a bad thing, at least from the point of view of a modern player. In fact, I've heard that criticism. I have modern players that have tried to play old school essentials, and they're like, these rules are terrible. Sometimes I'm rolling high, sometimes I'm rolling low. It seems completely arbitrary. I don't understand, and that just to like what their modern perspective, how it kind of feels to them if they just start running it off the page, right?
Right. And I think that if people have in their head the idea that there is more improvisation involved in this style of game, um, that is something, and there's a relatively, positive connotation to the word improvisational. People get that. They've seen
Right.
improvisational acting. They can import that over into playing a game, that it's a more improvisational game. And when you look at the rules that way, with the idea, okay, these are the rules for an improvisational game, you realize, okay, it's a different type of game, therefore the rules are going to look different. And you don't get that sort of speed bump of seeing, you know, descending armor class, ascending armor class. If it's improvisational, you're more like, okay, I get that. I can see how that works. And in some cases, you'll even, see, there is no skill system. Well, okay, well, there wouldn't be, because we're doing it, based on what would I actually do. So, I've tried to bring in more of that sort of social contract at the table, um, kind of commentary into the second version of it, than just focusing more on, here are two different rules systems and how they work. So.
That to me seems like a really great idea, because I observe that one of the problems is we're kind of ensconced in all this jargon, I mean, we're talking about some people who are a casual brand audience, and they want to try a different kind of game that could really free them and really give them, because a lot of people want a more free-form game, actually.
Oh yeah.
And they don't even know that's an option. I certainly felt that way, but then it's sort of encased in all this jargon about concepts and ideas and axioms and acronyms and stuff, and to kind of become more primordial about it, more common sense, and just say, think of it as improvisational, seems like it'd be really helpful. But let's just say that someone, they want to So I'll say that. I'll say, well, think of this as improvisation. And then they'll say, well, of course it's improvisation, but I need a rule system so that I can actually engage with the world. I need something I can do. And then I say, yeah, but imagine that the rules are improvisational. Like the actual way that you approach the whole game can be more freeform and improvisational, just like you would improv or improv comedy.
Right. And I wouldn't suggest that, all of the rules are improvisational either when you're talking to people, because everybody has, if you think of it this way, when you're playing 5th edition, you have a basket of resolution mechanics. You've got ability
Right.
checks, you've got skill checks, you've got disadvantage, advantage. The DM has a bunch of tools at their disposal, and it's the same thing when you're playing an old school game. It's just that with the old school game, the players largely don't know which resolution mechanic you might pick to fit a particular circumstance, whereas in the more modern games, where all of the rules are included in the player's handbook, they've got an idea that it should be call it a perception check. They've got every understanding that it ought to be a perception check, and so if the DM changes up on that and uses something else, like let's just roll a d6 and on a 1 you perceive it, then in that case, because of what you are bringing to the game, you're going to make the assumption that the DM is is tweaking stuff, and this might or might not be fair. Even if I trust my buddy Rob to try and be fair, I've seen his judgment; it's not that great. So, um, and whereas on the other hand, if the players approach it the way that they do with the old school thing, which was from a perspective where a lot of those rules were actually not put into the player's handbook, the idea that the DM is just going to pick some resolution mechanic and pick the best one is somehow less irritating, less weird, feels less like they are somehow tweaking the game, and it's just more like the way that the game works in something like that. So there the idea of the referee having a basket of resolution mechanics, that's present in both games. It's really just a question of whether if you've got a slope that's involved in a combat, 5th edition, probably you're going to treat that just as difficult terrain. But you wouldn't necessarily have to. What if the DM wants to make it more interesting and make it harder than difficult terrain, and say, well, you need to make, some sort of a saving throw type, or check or something like that to be able to get up and over this wall in the middle of the combat. Something that does definitely add a tactical element to a combat. And while you feel free to do that if you are playing an improvisational game, there is that element of, why are you making this more difficult, or why are you tweaking this, or what's the purpose of this change? And it's not like they would necessarily disagree. If you went through and explained it, hey, I want to throw a more interesting obstacle into the middle of the combat and make it more tactically interesting, people will probably be like, okay, great. But by the time you've had that discussion, you've broken the pacing of the game.
Yeah.
Whereas in the older school game, since it's just basically normal, to have the DM throwing in something like that, it doesn't break the pacing of the game. The results and probably what the two groups of players would agree to are exactly the same, but in one of them, you run into a pacing problem, and the other you don't, and that's the sort of often subtle differences between playing 5th edition and playing an older school version of the game. And when people dissect it on the internet afterwards, you see people saying, well, yeah, it wouldn't be any problem, in a 5th edition game. And it's like, yeah, it wouldn't, except for when it's actually happening at the table, that those, extra few back and forths of discussion about the rules, actually create kind of, a less cool, playing experience.
Right.
So
So
the
like
differences often are subtle.
Yeah, so is it kind of like in 5th edition, to use that example, it sounds almost like the what's under the hood, the guts of the engine is out there for the players to actually use and interact with, and there's an expectation for that, so that it should always be, there should be an orthodoxy, there should always be a certain way Like, if this is difficult terrain, it cuts my movement in half. It can't cut it by 3/4. It can't, this is how that rule works. Versus in what you're describing, this improvisational play, would you say maybe maybe it's sort of, it makes me think of that kind of Gary Gygax, I don't know if it's a legend or if it's true, but some say, he would just say, you don't have a character sheet. Like, just interact with the world. And
Oh, well, that's the that's
a
the advice.
little further in that direction anyways.
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely that's the advice that's given to most people who are trying to, do old school DMing or, get a group of people, is that, take a look at your players. If they're still looking at their character sheets, they haven't quite grasped what's going on yet.
Right.
Whereas if they're looking at you at the DM, possibly frowning, but if they're looking at you, then they're in the they've grasped the method that's being used there. So
let's go back to the example of Rob real quick, and let's say Rob, he's learning how to be an old school referee, and he's gotten a lot of frowns, and he's gotten some disagreements, and they've kind of worked this out in communication. I've had this experience for sure, where especially right now I'm running Classic Traveler, and there is no discrete resolution mechanic at all.
Nope,
right?
None at all. Jack of all trades is the best thing to take because it apparently gives you a skill in everything. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes the author of Classic Traveler will go on to like a 4-paragraph exposition of how operating an anti-aircraft battery might work, but there are no numbers. And then sometimes it's a single sentence with 2 numbers, and it doesn't have any, it's different from skill to skill. But anyways, I've had these conversations. Now, let's say Rob, he has been doing this for a while, and he's made some of these rulings. They have this trust. Eventually, the players have this trust that Rob will present something entertaining, and then they will interact with the world instead of, with the guts and mechanics and the engine under the hood of how the game works, and they leave that to Rob. What does Rob's success look like? Like 5 sessions in, where these players are like, wow, that is way better than me having those guts, than me having, having the engine of the game world of the game system, and I'm the one that has that. It's way more entertaining to have Rob do that. What does that success look like, and what do you get that you wouldn't get if the players had all sorts of buttons to push?
I mean, I think that overall it's more unexpected moments happening. That the pacing tends to be better. That Rob doesn't have to stop and look up, a rule in order to get it right. It's more. It's a more diversely. The experiences of playing are probably somewhat broader than if you're playing with a more comprehensive rule set. I mean, I don't think it has to do with the quality of the play itself. So, I mean, I guess what I would say is that the success is those 5 sessions under Rob's belt in which people have been having a lot more fun, less interrupted by rules, because you're gonna still have disputes, when you're using an old school methodology. It's not like a player's not going to raise his hand and say, wait a second, I ought to have a better chance of succeeding, at climbing a wall or something like that. And there's going to be, back and forth about it. And I think usually, the way that I usually tell DMs to work it is that, realize that while you are the final authority on what, is going to be, I definitely entertain, if somebody thinks that they would have a better chance of something, then there's some disjunction in the visualization, of how steep is the wall or something like that.
Right.
That, it'd be like, well, wait, I ought to be able to just scamper right over, and then it's either, yeah, you're right, you would scamper right over it, or you're picturing a wall that is way less steep than the one that I've got in my head. It's one or the other of those two, and I think there is more. I guess I don't really want to say that there's more skill involved in being an old school DM, but certainly, I still stick to the idea that a bad old school DM will actually be worse than a bad 5th edition DM, because there are just more things to screw up. There's more judgment calls. There's more, social
Yeah.
acumen going on around the table. So when somebody says, hey, your DM could be bad in an old school game, you're right. You are absolutely right. But the thing is that I think also that a medium to good DM will probably be better because they're more freed up, by approaching it with the old school thing, because you're a little bit less constrained in terms of the rules.
Interesting. Yeah, in my
but
trade, we have a saying about that. A an an excellent Boeing pilot is an excellent Boeing pilot, and a bad Boeing pilot is a bad Boeing pilot. But a excellent or a bad Airbus pilot is a good Airbus pilot, and an excellent Airbus pilot is a good Airbus pilot.
exactly, it is exactly
it's
that
automated,
kind of
and
thing.
you're
Yeah.
depending on a filter of other systems instead of your own fine acumen and things like that.
Yeah, but I don't think it serves anybody to say, look, any DM is going to be better using old school rules. That's not true.
Interesting.
Um,
Okay.
I do think that there is, that while there is a lot more room to succeed, there's also somewhat more room to fail in that kind of DMing.
I could see that. Yeah, and one of the things you said, it makes me think of my conversation with Jim Parkin, because he was he has these games that he can run a game for like 3 months without a dice roll. It's kind of the peculiar thing, but to him, what you're describing about the wall example is that is the game. The more you communicate and the more you offer information and choices, the more they're making choices, and then you see the results of those choices, and that just, you go on and on and on, and that you would depend on that a lot. It sounds like as an old school
Yeah, I
game.
think so. I mean, as and there are differences, of opinion, among, um, old school gamers. I'm definitely of the school, of referee that will tell the players what the odds are, because
Yeah, I like that
there are
too.
there are some people who are like, well, I'm describing the wall. I'm just going to do a really good job of describing the wall, and then it breaks the
And then it's
feel of
on
things
them.
as we
Yeah.
start talking numbers. And I don't agree with that. If I have to explain it, I'm like, well, they would be able to mentally calculate odds on their own.
Right.
But the thing is, it's a game. There are going to be some numbers in there. It's a lot smoother, and gives the players more agency if I'm like, okay, here's how I'm going to do it for this wall. I'm going to roll a D6, and you can get over it if you roll a 1 or a 2. And then if they're like, well, hey, what about a 3? Couldn't I? I'm really fast. Okay, fine, you can do it on a 3, or no, you can't do it on a 3. I'm going to hold to the 2d6. But I do discuss odds,
Yeah.
with players, and I certainly think that's a good idea. But in that one, that's me subjectively talking about the way that I do it, as opposed to the way the whole old school does it, because there are different schools of thought.
It also makes me, this kind of improvisational play you're talking about makes me think of my friend James Spahn, because he started with story games. He started with like well, he didn't start with that, but like that was like his whole thing, was stuff like Vampire the Masquerade, and he doesn't have, when he talks about it, he doesn't have like a loyalty to original D&D. Now, I'm enamored with it. I think I have a little bit of I think this is cool because it's retro also. Like, I have that aesthetic appreciation. But when he talks about it, he says he doesn't have that at all. Like, he doesn't care if it's original D&D or not. For him, the big feature is he feels like the rules just got out of the way. And
Yeah, I mean, James is very, very, omnivorous. He's probably the lead freelancer. He's our go-to freelancer. He wrote Legacy of Blackscale Lagoon, which was the module that we came out with Swords and Wizardry. He and I are on the phone, on a weekly basis, probably talking about stuff. So, I think that's a pretty apt view of the way that he approaches the kind of thing. It's a question of how is this going to work as a game. It's not about a particular rule set.
okay, so now this sounds like a challenging thing then, if somebody wanted to try to run an old school game. It sounds like like you said, there's a possibility that maybe you make some bad rulings and it's not fun, So if that's the case, how does someone get started? I started like 3 years ago now. I ran Knave initially. I don't know. I think I ran Knave because it felt like 5th edition and it felt safer. And then I ran 5 Torches Deep, actually, because it felt safer. And it didn't go well. I mean, I had fun, but it like that was a game where one of the players was like, I just feel like I didn't have anything to do. Like Well, one player died 3 times, and and I had not developed these principles that took time to develop. How does somebody break through to the other side where they get to this free-form improvisational gameplay where it moves really fast and they present something very entertaining for their friends?
I mean, I wish I had good advice, but since I learned back at the time that everybody was learning, with only the improvisational rule set, I'm not 100% sure. I would suggest probably, playing with somebody who's running an old school game at a convention and seeing it in action is probably the most helpful way of doing it, because for all the writing in the world and for all the time that I spend trying to describe it, description is just not the same as seeing it, because a lot of it is social skills. You can read the description of what a DM is saying, but you're maybe not seeing the hand gestures and things that go into something like that, and everybody does it differently. So I think the first thing is that if you're gonna try running an old school game, you really want to make sure that the gaming group that you're doing it with is on board with the idea, because you see a lot of people who are like, wow, I found this neat new thing, I want to introduce it to my friends, it sounds really cool. Some of the friends are resistant to trying a new game, because people do tend to get very, very attached to the role-playing game, either that they've learned or that they're currently playing, but definitely the first one that they ever play. And that tends to shape everything that you do after that with any RPG. And I cite a difference between the people who started playing D&D versus those that started with Traveller, and it's an interesting thing to explore, but there's a difference between them. But anyway, if you've got some of your players who are in some sense resistant to the type of thing, because even if they cause a little bit of trouble, or even if they snark just a little bit about the thing it's doing, it's really hard to learn how to run a really, really cool game of D&D. Even if you're playing 5th edition, it's really hard to learn how to be a DM when you've got all of the rules set out for you. When you don't have them all set out for you, it's exponentially more difficult. So it's like, start with a group of people who really are on board. Would be my suggestion. And if you don't have a group of people that really they're on board, I would say maybe go to a convention, play in a couple of old school games, look at the techniques that are being used, because there's a lot that goes into it. So I don't really have a great, I've done sort of with the old school primer, I've sort of done the best I can, and that's where I ran out of ideas for helping.
Yeah, no, I actually agree. If I could go back in time, because I had this experience where I was a 5th edition dungeon master for 6 years, and then I started watching Questing Beast, and I observed. My experience was, when I think of Dungeons and Dragons, I think of an adventurer with a cloak, and like Lord of the Rings, with muddy boots and carrying a backpack and blade, and they go into a tavern and they sit gloomily in a corner and make their plans on a map, and then they have to go on an adventure where they have to travel through something perilous to find something valuable. They go on this hero's journey. And my experience with D&D 5th edition was, and I offered this criticism recently somewhere, where actually, if you look at the rules, it literally suggests you not have a overland portion. Like, it just says the DM should just describe this. And then it has no rules for a dungeon. It doesn't have any rules. It has rules in the DMG for a city, interestingly. But if you get to the adventure section, there are no rules for a wilderness or for a dungeon. So I discovered in Questing Beast, Oh, and the other thing is that the Goldilocks zone of play rapidly pushes you into something very heroic, where you need to play a role in the world, and you almost assume these responsibilities. Where I kind of wanted something where I could freely interact with the world and just and be my own person and not have the world tell me who I was. And Questing Beast videos showed me that. Like, I was like, oh, this is a game where just traveling through the wilderness is a mechanical part of the game that matters, and there are things that will happen in it that are unexpected, and I can just choose. And so here I was in this position where I wanted to do that, and I'm like, how do you do that? How do you get your friends to do it? And I made exactly the mistake you were describing, where I tried to figure out how to convince my friends to stop, or because, you know, we're all limited in time. So therefore, stop playing the thing that we loved to do the thing that a lot of people just didn't want to do. And what I really think I should have done was find someone to mentor me and actually shuffle in and be a level 1 fighter or thief or magic user in an old school game. That's what I should have found, and then learned it. With the online setup that we have with Discord, there are a dozen looking for group Discord servers with tons of games available. I think I'll do a whole episode just on that, on highlighting where you can get in a game, because right now you can essentially get in a high quality old school game tomorrow if you wanted to.
Yeah.
And that's what I think that's what I should have done.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, and once you've got your legs under you as an old school DM, you can definitely, once you don't have the insecurity about the rules, you know, you can run an old school game that will demonstrate to the players what the difference is between the two, because you'll have somebody ask, well, what can I do? And then you're just confident, you know, saying, well, have you got a 10-foot pole? Have you got any kind of tool that you can use? You want to look around and see whether there's maybe a tool that's nearby. You know, but you really have to be confident in what you're doing before you can really get people to get people who are at least partially resistant to recognize, okay, well, these are two different kind of games. You know, maybe I do enjoy this, maybe I don't. But the other thing is, you know, there are a bunch of people who really do just honestly prefer a type of game that's got you know, relatively comprehensive rules, because they don't want to focus on the rules. What they want to focus on is, you know, what you're doing with the rules, and they don't mind whether it takes a little bit of extra time. You know, and then on the other hand, you've got, you know, a group of players who, like you, even when they started playing 5th edition, were like, you know what, this feels a little bit regimented to me. I'm just, you know, rolling the dice, moving the mice, kind of thing. And I think, you know, and then of course there are some players who can, you know, like either one of the two, depending on what it is. But I think that a lot of players do, you know, tend to fall, you know, more in one direction than the other. And so if you can get the ones who are feeling like, you know, yeah, maybe a little bit more, you know, improvisational type of play would be more fun, you know, that's the group to try and learn with if you can.
Okay, yeah, so it sounds like if I were to represent these first 2 paragraphs, if I were to especially, I'm thinking of people, they're coming into our play club right now, and they're like, I've heard of Shadow Dark, I want to play it. And one thing Shadow Dark does have in common with Swords and Wizardry is, if you take the same approach, the rules will not be there for you. And in fact, Shadow Dark is very thin on rules. That's not fair to say. It's thin on maybe player-facing or maybe character-facing rules, but there are tons of rules for the world and procedures and stuff. But anyways, so I want to try to give something to these people to help them bridge that gap. And it sounds like one thing is to emphasize that your entire approach to the rules would be different, that it's an improvisational exercise, and that it's more open-ended instead of having like a list of things that you can sort of activate. And that it sounds like this is a skill to develop, and like not to just like, would it be fair to say don't come to conclusions just on one session of play? Like maybe, especially if people, they're not going to find someone. What happens with a lot of people is if you want to play a game, you have to referee the game. That's all, like if you're passionate about it. And
Pretty much, yeah.
yeah, and if that's the case, like don't say, okay, well, this is what the game is based on one session of play. Maybe it's going to take some time to cook, and you're going to have to develop the skills first, and then keep working on it. Is that fair to say?
Oh yeah, because I mean, it's not only the DM that has to develop skills for old school.
That's
play,
true too. Wow, yeah.
the players do as well. So if you, in that first time they're not going to have the skills either. While you're learning them as a DM. And the question is, do they even trust you, given that you're stumbling over, how to handle a wall in combat? While you're stumbling over that, are they going to trust your advice about, well, think about tools, think about,
Right.
this or that? So it's, yeah, it's not an easy thing, you know, to introduce, an entirely different play style to people. You've got all of the resistance that people have when you're talking about doing a genre switch from fantasy to
Oh,
science
yeah,
fiction.
it's true.
A whole lot of people are going to be like, well, no, I really like fantasy. Why do we want to play a sci-fi game?
Yeah.
It's absolutely as difficult as making that kind of a jump.
So, all right. So it sounds like to gain this mentorship, to actually see it unfold, I would recommend you can watch things. So going back to Ben Milton, he just pointed a camera down at the table and ran Winter's Daughter, the module, which I thought was fantastic. That had a quality to it that was better as an educational thing than, say, an actual play, where sometimes it's more audience facing. Like you can actually watch how this kind of unfolds. But then ideally, actually go to a convention and meet people and watch it and play it. But if somebody can't do that, there are tons of places online. I'll put some of them in the description, actually, including our play club, where we'll actually, if somebody comes in, they're like, I want to try this, I'll make it happen. Because I don't know why, but I have a bug about that. Maybe because of the difficulties I went through. I don't know. But let's say, that none of those options are available because of time constraints or whatever. A lot of people, it's just people, and they start playing with their kids, or they start playing with their family, and they had that same sense that I do, where they wanted an adventure game experience from the get-go.
Yeah, because that's the one thing. If you're playing with kids, it's really hard to run a game that has comprehensive rules, because they'll absolutely.
I thought that too.
think
Like, it's easier for kids to play these games than it is modern game.
It's hard for kids to play a game that's got comprehensive rules.
And my wife, it's that way. Like, I mean, obviously, I do like these simpler games, so I don't mean to sound so critical. It's true if people like 5th edition or whatever, but for my wife, creating a 5th edition character felt like doing taxes. There's so many things that you have to do, and she loves like a Dungeon Crawl Classics funnel, where she has almost nothing, and she's just interacting with it, and goofy stuff is happening. She just adores that, and we've had so much fun. But all right, let's say that you have that set up, because there's a lot of people like that. And what would you say is the easiest way to get something down on the table when you've got a referee that doesn't have a lot of experience, and players that don't have a lot of experience, or the players are your kids or something like that?
Well, I mean, it's probably using a pre-module, and out of those, probably the best one is the old Keep on the Borderlands module, which was designed for that. It was designed for that. It still works. A lot of people have written other introductory adventures. We've got one, Legacy of Blackscale Lagoon, written by James Spahn. If you're looking for something that you're going to be able to easily get your hands on, I think that it's still pretty easy to find copies of Keep on the Borderlands, and that because it walks you through it, through what the process is.
Interesting, yeah.
You hints along the way of how here here's what it here's the box text that describes the room, here's what happens in the room, but also here's a little bit of commentary about assuming that you're a real beginner. So that's generally, I think, the best introductory module. And I say that was actually not the first one that I played with. I was in the In Search of the Unknown generation, which was B1 rather than B2, which was solely dungeon, and that's a very good one too. But I think that Keep on the Borderlands does a better job of being a true introductory module even than B1.
Yeah, I agree about as my experience as someone who has recently learned old school games. Actually, I agree with that too. I wish I could go back in time and say this is something, because there's a lot of stuff in the TSR ages which would be very hard for somebody just to pick up. If you literally picked up old original D&D, it is incomprehensible. Like it almost makes no sense. But the starter modules, like Keep on the Borderlands, I also think of like B4 is just a masterpiece introductory module, because it has all the stuff and it says, all right, you're new, here are the things you do and here's why you're doing it. And then it leads you through it, and all you have to do is do the procedure as you go from place to place, and they make choices. And yeah, those introductory modules, even B11, which came out much later, is like a starter set module, and the design of it is meant to teach, and it does it in a really good way. That's a good point.
Yeah, I think that's usually the best way for a starting DM to do it. It at least takes out part of the worry that you might be doing something wrong. Um,
Yeah, that's true.
Just by having it there, and it just removes that particular area of anxiety from the equation. Because a lot of it has to do with confidence.
Yeah. And the interesting thing for me is a lot of that stuff that you're mentioning is a complete 180 from what I would have said a year and a half ago. And I'm just now starting to realize some of the stuff you're saying.
Yeah, well, I mean, my approach to everything is that, it's best to confront the difficulties head on, because nothing has no difficulties to it. So that's why
That's
I'm
true
like,
too.
I'm like, yep, an old school DM can be worse than somebody who's doing a boring job but following the rules in 5th edition.
Yeah.
You know, that yep, it's pretty hard to learn. It's just it doesn't help anybody to try and hide the differences. So like you were talking about, people saying
It's a
minimize
cognitive dissonance is what I see arise, where they're
yeah, and
looking at it from the lens of 5e, and they're like, this is a terrible 5e game. And they're right.
Yes,
it's a terrible
exactly.
5e game. That's not what it should be.
The best way to handle cognitive dissonance is basically to say, okay, let's start from scratch. This is what we're doing. This is the goal. It is an entirely different, in almost all respects, it is entirely different. And in fact, I think that one of the things in the new primer that I wrote was that old school D&D and 5th edition D&D both have D&D in the title, but they're entirely different games. And I think that's the best way to think about it, is that this is an entirely different game. My knowledge of the other game, I'm going to try and put that entirely aside and just look at this for what it is, because there's so much blurring that happens.
Yeah, like even like the premise you start with, I've found I need to do that. Is I had this assumption with 5th edition, which is true, is that you're going to be a hero. You're going to be some sort of action-oriented character, and you're going to have stunts, and you're going to be successful in combat. And I had to start with the premise and say, listen, you are here to survive and get inside of this dangerous place and get the treasure out. And none of the how do you do that doesn't matter. Like the fact that the monsters are there doesn't mean you need to fight them. In fact, that might be a bad idea. But it's up to you. But that's the premise of the game. I had to start back at the very premise of what are you even doing here, and then operate from that.
I mean, one way of doing it, it so much depends on your group, because there are some people who are so, worried about the idea that, old school gaming has this reputation for lethality to it. And it's like,
right.
But if you've got a group that's okay with that, then here's a really easy way to do it, is that look, there are two different kinds of video games. There's the kind of video game where everything gets more difficult as you get better. And there's the kind of video game where, it depends on where you are. And so one of the things I've said in this one, is the risk and reward in an old school game depend on where you are, not who you are.
Yeah.
And so, and it's this idea that you're trying to get something. So there is a real challenge to the game, and it's challenging. It's a difficult game. Some people eat that up.
Right.
and if you get the people who are wanting to take on a difficult game, these are the people who play with no cheat modes on the hardest version possible of the video game. If you've got people with that kind of psychology, then that kind of view is very easily assumed for them. And if you tell them, you know what, you're trying to survive, I guarantee you some exciting stuff is going to happen. It's just not going to happen as a result of a particular number or formula that's on your character sheet. But I guarantee you there are going to be thrills, chills, and spills. And that and again, that's the other thing is when I'm DMing, a lot of times if something goes wrong, it goes wrong hilariously, and things can become incredibly complicated situations, and that's the joy in watching something go spectacularly sideways and still managing to pull it out. That tends to be more of the old school game type of thing, whereas in the more modern approach, it still tends to remain pretty much within the parameters of the dice rolls.
Right.
And so even if something does go bad, it's like it's either so bad and you're thinking, okay, well that means I've got to roll a 20. And there's a big difference between thinking, okay, I've got to roll a 20, as opposed to thinking, I got to slide under this dragon and get the sword in between some weak point in his armor.
Right.
And those are two very different psychologies of the game. And it's not like 5th edition. 5th edition is a good system. It's, I don't mean to run 5th edition down in any way. It's just that it's a different type of system.
Right.
And it's just, it's just, that's the hallmark of the old school play, tends to be that you're visualizing what happens and what you can do, rather than being pushed toward thinking about it in terms of a number. And the games are so similar in a lot of ways that it's sometimes very hard to see what that difference really is. That was why I had such a tough time answering the question you asked me about Rob the DM. What is the mode of his, what is the benchmark of his success? I'm like, it's going to be pretty subtle. It's just that the way that the game has developed in the course of his 5 sessions is going to be subtly different from what it would have been in 5th edition. It'll be subtly less numerical. It'll subtly have the players making more eye contact with the DM, and therefore it's more of a social type of interaction, where you're friends talking to friends rather than friends looking at character sheets.
Right.
It'll subtly have more of a sense of achievement because that the risk level that you were taking on had to do with your decisions about where to go, and that it's not being nerfed because you are a particular character level, and therefore you are coming up against monsters that have a particular. Okay, it's all very, very subtle, but when it all adds up, you get a gaming experience that is quite different.
Yeah,
but it's really hard watching it to put your finger on it and say, aha, there's a difference happening right there in between these two simulcasts of 2 different games of the same encounters, being run, one in 5th edition, one in 0. It would be very hard to put your finger on it, but you would perceive 2 very different shows.
Yeah, one of the things you said you said you're going to emphasize in this new primer, the idea that lethality and danger is tied to place, not character. I often say that because what I will say is in an old school game, well, first I'll say in a modern game, a dragon is there as part of truly a string of choices related to what your character is. So like at certain points, you need to use healing word. You need to know to do certain things. You need to maneuver your armor class. Not to say that you don't do that entirely in an old school game, but in a new school game, you need to do a pattern of math and things related mechanically to it that's going to lead you up to a dragon eventually. But in an old school game, what I love about it is that dragon is there. It's there at level 1. It's there at level 10. Doesn't matter, it's there. So if you go there at level 1, it's going to be there. If you go there at level 10, it's going to be there. And what that produces for me as a player, because I love playing in old school games. I probably like playing in them more than I like running them. Not that and I love running them too. But for me as a player, what it feels like is I really can choose. I can choose. Like I can, with everybody else at the table, we can decide if we want to take that risk or not, and how we want to approach things. And that's really thrilling to me.
Yeah, I mean, the player agency issue, which is a term that's come up over the more over the last 10 years in discussions about RPG, is the way that player agency works is different in the two games. And I would argue that when it comes to what are our characters going to do, you've got somewhat more player agency in the old school game than you do in the more modern style as well.
Yeah, I love that, and the minimalism and everything. It's brought us a lot of joy and a lot of fun. Like I said, every week we've played about 60 sessions as one group of Swords and Wizardry using Rappanathic. We just have so much fun. And that world has had about 60 players come and go over 2.5 years, and it feels like a secondary fictional world that sometimes we just go into, and it's honest, and what we do in it, it's up to us what we decide to do in it. So it's been a lot of fun. But okay, so I'm very excited to hear about this update to the primer, and also so these books, you said that there'd be a supplemental rule book and a monster book, and that's for Swords and Wizardry.
Yeah, it's for Swords and Wizardry. It's just for the group of people that do want to have more character options. I mean, there's two groups of players. I think with original D&D there's the group that like the very archetypal, very limited group of character class, but there's a bunch of other people who like to have new interesting character classes. So there are new character classes. There's a lot of discussion about various house rule type of options, sort of the same way that the initiative system has got several different options in Swords and Wizardry, and new magic items and so on and so forth in the supplemental book. And then for the monsters, it's a monster book. So,
well, I'm very excited about all of that, and the primer, or the update to the primer, and I really appreciate you talking about this. This is kind of a living discussion, because there are people as we speak coming into our play club saying, all right, what do I do? And they want to play these games. We might be bringing another person on, which I hope would be like a brand new player that wants to learn in our Swords and Wizardry game. So this is an important discussion for us. Thanks again, Matt. If people want to find you and Susie and Mythmere, where would they go? Where would they find your products?
Mythmeregames.com is our website. We do have a Facebook page, and Swords and Wizardry has a Facebook group called the Official Swords and Wizardry group. So that's probably the best places. We have probably signing up for the newsletter at mythmeregames.com is probably the easiest way to get reliably in touch with us.
Oh, that's awesome. So the newsletter is a direct to email kind of thing, an email list.
Yes.
Kind of. Oh, that's fantastic. Good. Yeah, I will put that link in the description. And Matt, thank you so much for coming and talking to us about this.
Oh, thank you for having me on the show. It's been fun.
Mythic Mountains RPG is a private online play club that focuses on folk RPGs. Folk RPGs are the games that belong to all of us. They're what actually happens at a table between friends. It's their voice that has the authority on what is fun and what works for them. Weekly, we upload our games to allow others to sit in with us. The channel isn't monetized. We don't own the artwork, music, software, or games shown in these actual plays, and you can find links to their authors in the description. Like, subscribe, and share if you wish, or don't. Just like games in person, you're welcome to pull up a chair, sit in, and watch some of our games. No performances, no fancy equipment, just regular people playing folk pencil and paper role-playing games and having a good time. We hope these games will prove a source of enjoyment to anyone just wanting to listen in, anyone looking for examples of how actual groups run and play folk RPGs, and most importantly, if you haven't found your group yet, you're welcome here at ours.